Dr. Ken Landau. Let's continue our discussion of breast cancer screening and how we can hopefully reduce the toll of this dreadful disease. Each year, breast cancer will affect about 240,000 women in the United States, and 40,000 women are going to die because of breast cancer. So obviously we have a significant problem, and we need some sort of screening technique to allow us to make the diagnosis at an early and a curable stage. Well, mammograms are thought to do that. But unfortunately, as we study the technique of mammography more thoroughly, we find that it doesn't provide nearly the benefits that it's supposed to, and we find that a lot of women who have mammograms are being told that an abnormality exists when indeed none does. So they go through the emotional turmoil, they go through perhaps a biopsy, maybe some other kind of treatment, and in the end they're told that, well, they don't really have a problem. Well, that's not acceptable. It's been traditional that you should get your mammogram every year. But the latest findings and the latest report and the latest recommendation from now the United States Preventive Services Task Force, that's the organization that determines what is appropriate screening in the United States, what they say is don't do the mammograms every year, do the mammograms every other year. Every other year if you're an average risk woman between the ages of 50 and 74, and if you're between 40 and 49, it's not very helpful. And if you're over age 74, there's no evidence it's, again, of any benefit. As a matter of fact, the average age for diagnosis of breast cancer in the United States is about 64. Average age of death is about 68. Well, in order to gain a better understanding of breast cancer, we have to look at what we do for women who have dense breasts. About half of the women have dense breasts. A dense breast is a breast that contains a lot of glandular tissue, a lot of the breast tissue, not a lot of fat, but instead the glands associated. Now, there's some problem with making the diagnosis of dense breasts. We know that dense breasts may harbor an increased incidence of cancer. But what is a dense breast? Well, if you show a mammogram to a series of different radiologists, you're going to get a variety of different opinions. Well, to address the problem, now we have a new technique. And the new technique is called 3D imaging, or tomosynthesis. And tomosynthesis is a new way of looking at the breast. It's sort of like a CAT scan of the breast. The breast is compressed, and then a machine actually goes in an arc of 15 to 40 degrees, taking one image every millimeter. That's 25 images an inch. And what it does is, with appropriate software, it puts it all together so that the radiologist gets a clearer view of the breast, and then by doing that allows him to catch more cancers or diagnose more cancers. Some people have likened it to looking at a book. Well, in the tomosynthesis, it's like holding the book in your hand and paging through it. You get a view of every page. Well, if you do the standard breast imaging, it's sort of like putting the book on the table and looking at the book. Well, certainly you can say that intuitively it makes more sense. The 3D imaging, the tomosynthesis, ought to allow us to resolve the problems with both dense breasts and the overlapping tissue when the tissue gets compressed. Some doctors now recommend that this is the standard screening technique. They say that it allows about a 40% greater diagnosis of breast cancer, and it reduces the likelihood of harm because women are going to be told that something is wrong when, after study, it's found that nothing is wrong. And certainly if the breast is damaged, maybe because of previous surgery or previous biopsy, well, it's harder for the standard mammogram to be read, and maybe this is going to provide a significant benefit. It's said by some of the advocates that this is state-of-the-art technology, it's the standard of care, it's a revolutionary technique according to some people, a breakthrough. Well, it ought to be. Each machine costs in excess of $700,000, often up to around $1 million. And somebody's got to pay for that, and you want to have advantage, you want to have some sort of a benefit for the extra expense. A lot of different companies are manufacturing the machine, and the whole technology is disseminating throughout the United States much more rapidly than any other breast screening therapy or technique passed into society. So compared, say, to digital imaging, oh, this is much faster. And even though it's only been around for several years, more than half of the members of the Breast Cancer Surveillance Consortium already have bought into the technology. But it's very important to realize that the researchers into tomography, into the tomosynthesis, do not have enough information at the present time to say whether this is a technique that is better than, the same as, or worse than the standard mammography in evaluating cancer and in avoiding false positive diagnoses. It was only approved in the United States in 2011. It was a technique that must be combined in the original days with the standard mammography. 2013, it was a standalone technique. By 2014, the American College of Radiology said, hey, this is not investigational, this is the real thing. And actually, in 2015, Medicare and some of the different state Medicaid organizations said, well, we'll reimburse you as long as you combine it with the standard 2D mammography, the traditional digital mammography. Well, many of the centers did the technique both at the same time in order to reduce the likelihood of recalls. But the insurance industry looked at the information and said, hey, we have a problem here. You say this is so great. Well, can you show us that it reduces the likelihood of death from cancer in women? That's what we're trying to screen for. And unfortunately, at the present time, there's no evidence that finding all these tumors is really adding to the longevity in women. There's no evidence that this technique, the 3D imaging or the tomosynthesis, is capable of reducing the death rate from breast cancer. Just remember the story with prostate cancer. Men were told, go and get your PSA on a regular basis, and if the PSA was abnormal, then you were supposed to go and have a biopsy, and if the biopsy showed that there was a tumor, as it frequently did, a cancer, then get your prostate out. That would save your life. But then the studies came out and said, you know something? A lot of men have this kind of disease and they don't die. And the men who get the therapy don't seem to live any longer than the men who don't get the therapy, except the fact that the men who get the therapy have some complications from the therapy. Impotence or erectile dysfunction and incontinence. They pee in their diapers. Well, are we causing the same sort of problem with this 3D imaging of the breast? That's a major question. Now, the advantages supposedly are women who have those dense breasts, the dense breast that might harbor an increased incidence of cancer, and the dense breast that isn't very adequately evaluated by the standard digital mammograms. Well, maybe that's the reason to go and do the tomosynthesis or the 3D imaging. Or maybe a woman who has a family history of breast cancer, maybe a woman who has the BRCA1, BRCA2, then that is a woman who might be benefited. But at least as far as the density of the breast is concerned, if a breast is extremely dense, the tomosynthesis doesn't really perform up to expectations. On the other hand, if a breast is extremely fatty, you don't need it. So the benefit, theoretically, is in the women who have sort of more glandular elements than not. But the question is, how much benefit? Well, in studies in Europe, it was found that tomosynthesis was able to increase the diagnosis of breast cancer by a rate of anywhere between 2 and 3 per 1,000 women who were screened. And it was found in the United States that the improvement in diagnosis was relatively more minimal. So somewhere between 1 woman or 3 women in 2,000, not in 1,000. Well, supposedly, we get a better positive predictive value of an abnormal tomosynthesis report. So if the tomosynthesis shows us that a problem exists on the breast, it's more likely to be cancer than if it's not. However, it's important to understand that if the tomosynthesis shows a problem exists, the likelihood of a problem really existing is only between about 5 and 10% at best. And it's found that the tomosynthesis does not allow the breast cancer to be diagnosed at a smaller stage. And at least so far, it doesn't seem that it makes any difference in whether the lymph nodes are involved or not involved. And at least according to the United States Preventive Services Task Force, that's the organization that we mentioned before that determines what kind of screening is appropriate here in the United States, according to them, the evidence is really insufficient to assess the benefits of digital tomosynthesis, or the 3D mammography, as a primary screening technique for breast cancer. And as a matter of fact, it's insufficient, the evidence is insufficient, to decide that tomosynthesis is really better for patients who have significantly dense breasts, any more than MRIs or ultrasounds are better. Yes, indeed, we might have a reduced recall for abnormal reports, but the question is, and yes, indeed, we might have an increased likelihood of diagnosis of breast cancer, but the question is, does this translate to a decrease in the death rate from breast cancer? We don't want just another technique. We've got plenty of techniques. We want something that really works. And the question is, does tomosynthesis work? And the answer is, the evidence at the present time is not in. Remember the story of prostate cancer. Anyway, thanks for watching. I'm Dr. Ken Landau.